Um, all right, thank you again, everybody, and I'll let you take it away, Reid.
Mahalo nui, Emily. Aloha kako, mahalo for everybody that logged on this evening and taking the time to listen about precious plants or napua mai ole, those never fading and always beautiful flowers that we work to conserve. So we'll be talking about endangered plant conservation on Hawaii Island. And as a quick introduction, my name is Reid Loo, and I'm a natural resources manager with Kamehameha Schools, and very blessed to work alongside some very dedicated partners and friends on Hawaii Island. So mahalo nui. So as we progress through our presentation, there is going to be some subliminal messaging of native and rare flora that's native to the Big Island. So what I like to call these brief intercessions are the nanani o Hawaii. So looking at those different gems. And this first slide kicking us off is highlighting the diversity and beauty of some of our North Kona dryland forests. These species, which range from different Malvaceae, so folks in the hibiscus family, to our uhi uhi and iea pictured there, are worked on by different partners under the Division of Forestry and Wildlife and some of our conservation entities such as the Napu'u Resource Management and our friends down in Kaupulehu. So kicking us off is some endemic species from Kona. And also this statement that I have copied and pasted here is also from the Division of Forestry and Wildlife, and specifically the Hawaiian Rare Plant Program, to give us an overview of what exactly is our flora. So in the Hawaiian Islands, we're very blessed to have an amazing set of plants. There's nearly 1,400 vascular plant taxa. This is inclusive of species, subspecies, and variety that are native to the state of Hawaii. And about 90% of those are found nowhere else in the world. So key takeaways from that is that when we use the phrase found nowhere else or found only in Hawaii, we're really looking at native species that are endemic to the islands. And if 90% of our flora is endemic, we have nearly 1,260 plants that are found nowhere else. So really spectacular statistics. So to open up the space, and especially before we engage in all the work that we do and show photos of pretty plants, I just want to talk briefly about the origins of our Hawaiian flora, or in what we refer to in Hawaiian as our mo'okuauhau, and how our flora came to be. But first, we have another intercession of additional endemic flora. These species that you see in front of you are some of our endangered coastal plant species. These plants are found on most of the main Hawaiian islands, but looking at some of our popolo and ihi and ohai on the far right. So just to get folks accustomed to seeing some endemic coastal species, which are rare. In going back to our discussion on origins, so there are a few key topics that I'd like to talk about. This section is going to cover several millions of years, and it's going to be condensed in 5 slides or so. So there's a lot of information to cover. So let's get to it. The first thing I want to touch upon is isolation. So looking at this map that I really love because it's Hawaii-centric, having us smack dab in the middle of our screen, but Hawaii's geographic isolation has allowed organisms to evolve in relative solitude and with little competition. And what that means is that our isolation, is the reason why we don't have any native large land mammals that typically have grazing or foraging habits. So things like cows and horses, those kinds of things were not found in Hawaii. The next button here, labeled source, there's some very exciting research that's coming out of UH Hilo that Dr. John Price is heading, but a source, when we talk about this, it's like, well, if we're so isolated, where did our ancestral plants come from? We had to have flora come here naturally before it could evolve. And so this last button here is a depiction of where research suggests our ancestral plants are from. So starting on the far left-hand side, we have quite a few bit of what we refer to as colonizations. So events when ancestral plants from a distant Aina made its way to Hawaii. So we see quite a bit of colonization events with origins in Asia. So from East Asia, from the Indonesia and Malaysia region, and Australia. And mind you that from those continents, they made their way over by island hopping. So going through the different island groups in the Pacific. And then we also have arrivals from North America. We have arrivals that are a little bit more widespread across the tropics. So looking at a neotropical introduction. And lastly, there's also colonization events that we classify as widespread. So maybe having origins in more than one source region. So now that we know where plants came from, how did they arrive here? And a really popular thing, and I know that Emily and her group talk a lot about wind, wings, and water when they host different school groups. So that's what we'll dive into over the next couple of slides is what exactly does that mean? And I should share that when we refer to wind, wings, and water, we refer to those as dispersal events. So how they arrived and specifically, what method of dispersal. So the first is plants that arrived via wind. Research suggests that this accounts for a small number of colonization events. So a very small amount of our flora has wind dispersed origins. And that's mainly attributed to the infrequency of certain weather phenomena and certain jet streams that were consistent enough to influence that kind of activity in Hawaii. And species that are wind dispersed would most likely have really tiny seeds or spores for our ferns and pteridophytes. And for example, this is a depiction of how tiny Ohi'alehua seeds can be. Our second mechanism of arrival is what we call wing dispersed. So plants that arrive to the Hawaiian Islands via birds. And they may have come in one of two ways. The first is internally, so they were ingested abroad, a fruit that contained viable seeds, and subsequently deposited in Hawaii. And the second would be externally, so looking at propagules that may have been able to attach themselves to the outside of birds. And we have two examples. The one on the left is of Papalakepau or Pisonia brunoniana. This species was used by Native Hawaiians in collecting feathers for different types of implements and adornments. And then the photo on the right is of Synchris or Kamanomano. This rare taxa of grass has hook-like appendages on its fruit and are fruit and seeds and are really similar to barbs on fish hooks. And then rounding us off is our water arrivals, so seeds dispersed by water. These plants, their seeds can either float. So the picture at left shows some of our koali or Ipomea species that do have the ability to float, or seeds could have been contained within pods. You know, pods typically have a reservoir of air that's contained with the seeds, and that allows for flotation as well. And I guess in terms of the number of species that arrived or are believed to have arrived in Hawaii by this way, I think it accounts for a great number of what we refer to as indigenous species. So indigenous also means native, you know, seeds and plants that arrive by wind, wings, or water, but they may be found in other areas. So they're not geographically specific to Hawaii. So now that we talked about where some of our source populations or ancestral plants are from, we talked about how they may have made their way to the Hawaiian Islands through wind, wings, and water. We want to touch upon evolution and specifically the process of adaptive radiation. This is a very simple schematic that I put together, but it's also rapidly changing with some of the ongoing research that's happening today. So to start us off, I'm going to click on this first button, which refers to genre of Hawaiian Campanulaceae. So Campanulaceae is our bellflower family, or what we refer to as locally as lobeliads. And we'll talk more about the different levels of, I guess, taxonomy with plants, but a genre is a level above species, if that makes sense. And 5 of these are endemic. Those include Brighamia, Cyanea, Clermontia, Delicia, and Trematolobelia. Lobelia is the only one that's indigenous. So again, arrived by wind, wings, or water, but it has more of a cosmopolitan or worldwide distribution, and its origins are believed to be from Africa, if I'm not mistaken. Another tidbit of information about our Campanulaceae is that the earliest ancestral arrival may have been around 12 million years ago. So I forget specifically which island group, but within the Northwest Hawaiian Islands. So when that island was further south than its current position is when we attribute the first arrival of our Campanulaceae. And the last thing before we dive into our schematic is the tremendous amount of biodiversity that Campanulaceae account for. So nearly 1 in every 8 species within the Hawaiian flora is within the family Campanulaceae. So really cool. So moving along, I want to introduce the evolutionary process of adaptive radiation, as it's a very important and instrumental reason for our diversity. So adaptive radiation is a process in which organisms diversify rapidly from an ancestral species into multiple forms, species. And this typically happens when there's a change in the environment or there's a niche that needs to be filled. And we can elaborate a little bit more on that. So adaptive radiation is, the results of evolutionary processes where a single colonizer can become so diversified over time and speciate. As a disclaimer, the schematic here depicts what was previously accepted, showing one common ancestor giving rise to 6 genera and 126 species. And we would refer to that as monophyletic, so coming from one common ancestor. But recent research suggests that there may have been 2 colonization events. And this paper was recently published in 2021. So just putting that out there that this might be a little bit dated, and research is ongoing. But looking at the schematic, we can see from 1, possibly 2 introductions, giving rise to 6 genera, and then becoming 126 recognized species. So a high level of diversity resulting from 1 to 2 colonization events. And the reason why I have 126 plus is that there is still new discoveries being made. And particularly with this particular family, there's been new species described from West Maui within the past 5 years or so. And so the last button we have here is entitled coevolution. So as we talked about earlier with adaptive radiation, speciation happens more rapidly when there's a particular niche to fill. And so like our flora, our fauna have that same radiation pattern that we see. So if you look at the image of our native honey creepers, those are believed to have been derived from a common ancestor. And as the birds began speciating and becoming distinct species, these flora within the family Campanulaceae also evolved. And so that shows that symbiotic relationship between our flora and fauna, and how evolution occurred across different forms of life in the islands. So just to recap, that's a lot. We're talking about between 5 to 12 million years of history that we just went through in 3 slides. So mahalo for bearing with me, but to wrap this one up, some key takeaways is that our flora is descended from ancestral plants, which arrived by wind, wings, or water from various regions around the Pacific Basin, and some that are more widespread. Our high rate of endemism is attributed to our geographic isolation, and in particular, the absence of large predators or large land mammals. Large land mammals are what restrict diversity in continents and large land masses. And then the last point is that the evolutionary process known as adaptive radiation is responsible for high levels of diversity, and specifically in islands is where we see this type of radiation. And again, adaptive radiation refers to lots of species that derive from a common ancestor. Alrighty, so fast forwarding, we want to look at the status of the Hawaiian flora. The title of this is Endangered Plant Species on the Island of Hawaii, or Endangered Plant Conservation on the Island of Hawaii. And therefore, we need to understand what the status, what is going on in our environment, and particularly with our Hawaiian flora. But first, we have our last intercession of Nananio Hawaii. So looking at these, we just talked about adaptive radiation, and I thought this would be an appropriate place to add this slide that looks at native lobeliads to Hawaii Island. As a disclaimer, all of these pictures depict species that are critically imperiled and managed by the Plant Extinction Prevention Program. or PEP is the acronym that we use. And PEP has the mandate or responsibility of working with plant taxon that have 50 or less wild individuals remaining. So just as a quick highlight, because these are some of my favorite species to work with, in the top left, the top 3 left-hand photos are of Cyanea platyphila. This species is restricted to windward Hawaii Island. The top middle with that cluster of fruit and modified calyces is Cyanea hematiflora subspecies Carsonii. That species is restricted to Kona. And also on the top right is Cyanea marxii, which is also restricted to Kona. The bottom left-hand side, those 2 pictures depicts Cyanea tridomantha, which is contained to windward Hawaii, so from Kohala down to Ka'u. The middle bottom photo is what managers refer to as Cyanea fernaldii. This particular species is restricted to a single population and has fewer than 5 individuals remaining. And it definitely is one that needs more genetic analysis on to properly assign the correct species. And then last but not least, on the bottom right is Cyanea shipmanii, which is also restricted to windward Hawaii Island and has some really awesome divided leaves. So now going back to the status of Hawaiian flora. And what I mean by that is these statements are reflecting the total Hawaiian flora. So across the state of Hawaii, these numbers are not specific to Hawaii Island. But I also borrowed this from the Hawaiian Rare Plant Program administered by DOFA. It's good, but it's also a little bit confusing as designations can overlap. For instance, there might be some thought to be extinct taxa that are still listed as endangered. Before getting too technical, these are some numbers that really stood out. It's believed that 100 plant taxa or so have already gone extinct. 366 are listed as endangered or threatened by federal and state governments. An additional 48 species are proposed as endangered. So new additions to the endangered species list. And not to be forgotten is that Hawaii contains 44% of America's T&E plant species, and we comprise less than 1% of the total land mass. So seeing the severity and the multitude of species are really powerful statistics to remember. And because those are a lot of numbers that I don't remember myself, the easiest way is that there are a lot of rare. And when we use the word rare, that means endangered, threatened, proposed, thought to be extinct, endemic taxa that are at risk of extinction. So we all know what extinction means. It's gone forever. There's no ahui ho, we'll see each other again. It means that it's gone forever. And so now with some of those daunting statistics, maybe a little bit challenging to take in, we have to ask ourselves, why are plants in Hawaii endangered? And that's a very good question. And in order to do this, I've started with a timeline. And if you look at this timeline, it goes back 1,600 years or more. And this timeline coincides with human arrivals to the Pai'aina, or to the Hawaiian archipelago. And why this is important is that most plants in Hawaii, if not all, are endangered because of increased habitat loss over time. So when we say habitat, the native ecosystems that sustain our native flora have been degraded, have been erased, have been developed over time. So those all lead to larger implications, extinctions, endangerment, imperilment of more than just our flora. This extends to all flora and fauna or native organisms. So starting us off, and studies go back and forth, whether it's 1600 years ago or further. We like to think of it as time immemorial for Native peoples, but with science, they estimate that the earliest settlers, the Native Hawaiians, came 1600 years ago from the Marquesas and from the South Pacific. And in that time, we've developed a very sophisticated system of governance looking at land tenure. So most are familiar with our Ahupua'a system and how Native peoples were dwelling by coastal environments or lowland environments. There were several introductions of plant species that came with our ancestors, as well as different types of animals, such as the dog and Polynesian pig, which were more confined and kept closer to habitated sites. And then, as you can see on the top, with that system of governance, we've also developed a really sophisticated system of agriculture. So that's an example of lo'i on Oahu. We also did things like fish farming and some of our dryland agricultural systems, our mala'ai with ulu and sweet potato and other crops. So fast forwarding, Hawaiians thrived like our flora in relative solitude for 1400 years or so with no interaction from the Western world. And within the past 200 years, we see accelerated changes in land. So the middle photo shows, and I love this painting, or all of his paintings by Herb Kane, but when Captain Cook arrived in Kealakekua in the late 1700s. And as time went on, large swaths of land or large tracts of land converted native ecosystems to agricultural systems, Western agricultural systems. So at the top, this is from central Maui. We can see large expanses of pineapple and cane that formerly inhabited the central plain. And then on the bottom, we can see the rise of pastoral usage, so large areas, and especially on Hawaiʻi Island, the most impact of conversion to pasture. Also within this time, besides cattle, there were other introductions within the 200 years. So looking at axis deer being introduced on Molokai in 1865, looking at goats and different species of sheep, with mouflon coming as recent as the 1960s. So if we fast forward and we look up until the present day and beyond, we're still dealing with increased amounts of habitat loss. So as habitat loss increases, our biodiversity becomes further imperiled and our species richness tends to decline. And as you folks know, a lot of what comes in regularly are invasive species. So looking at the top, we see fountain grass, which is very evident in North Kona or the west side of Hawaiʻi Island. We see fungal pathogens, which are responsible for plant diseases. So we see things like rapid ohia death, which can cause rapid modification once the canopy dies back. We see urbanization, so looking at Oahu and Mamala Bay, looking across several ahupua'a extending from Moanalua going east towards Kaimuki. We see that urban expanse of Waikiki in the foreground, so development pressures. We see increases and expect to have, unfortunately, increased wildfire activity as a result of climate change and those implications with drought. We see more invasive introductions. That's the coconut rhinoceros beetle, which has devastated coconut populations across the Pacific and also target our native Pritchardia or Lolu. And last but not least, on the bottom right-hand corner, we see the possible effects of sea level rise and how they can affect our coastal and nearshore communities. So not only our flora and fauna, but also looking at the economic impacts to business developments. So that's a lot to take in. You know, a lot of habitat loss that's happened and especially accelerated within the past 200 years and continues to happen. And those kinds of stressors can be really daunting and cause some to have a really bleak outlook. However, this brings me to the next point. How do we combat extinction? You know, we know all of those things are happening. We're losing habitat and species are dying. So how do we combat extinction, or how do we mitigate for that? So this model here is what PEP, or the Plant Extinction Prevention Program, implements. And it's a result of a collective contribution from members of what we refer to as the Hawaiʻi Rare Plant Restoration Group, or HRPRG. I know that is a lot of acronyms for such a short presentation. I apologize. But the HRPRG is a voluntary consortium of various partners. So our field botanists, our natural resource managers, people in the community, and they serve as an advisory and a way to facilitate plant recovery discussions and provide guidance. And it's made up of public sector partners, so state and federal, as well as private entities. And rather than going through all of these tiles, this is a lot of information, but the 5-pronged approach that PEP uses, the first is to manage and mitigate threats to wild founders. The second is to monitor founders and outplantings. Monitoring is looking at assessing the health and tracking overall trends. So looking at vigor, looking at population size, phenotypic observations, and looking at the effectiveness of our conservation. So being sure that we're maintaining an adaptive strategy to our recovery. The third is collecting propagules. This one is really self-explanatory, but different propagules that allow for propagation of plants. These are usually done in partnership with ex situ facilities. Ex situ means offsite in Latin. So these look at our mid-elevation nurseries, as well as partners such as Lion Arboretum and other seed banks. The fourth is reintroductions. You know, Emily and Imipono no Ka'aina do a lot of outplanting of common species with some of our community members. And it's a really effective tool of developing Pilina to place and amongst site users, and specifically amongst people that call Hawaii home. So allowing them to work with Hawaii and contributing to a great cause. And then the last part is surveying for new founders. And I know we didn't cover all the tiles, but I have a few slides with some recognizable faces that we can go through that depict some of these actions in the field. So for mitigating threats, the most effective strategy that research has informed us on is excluding of ungulates. And this can be done at various scales. It can be done on a landscape level to protect an ecosystem. It can be as small as 4x4 to fence an individual plant. So fencing, conservation fencing is an important tool to exclude ungulates. In this photo, it also depicts collaboration, which is an important part of threat mitigation. So we have 3 different organizations represented in this photo, with myself from KS, Callie in the green from Three Mountain Alliance, and Aaron from the Plant Extinction Prevention Program. The second slide is also about mitigating threats, and you can see 3 additional photos of various fence construction. We see partners from TMA with Colleen, Josh Vandemark and Dave Cole from the Plant Extinction Prevention Program, as well as Kellen from TMA, Brennan Hozaki and others from Forest Solutions. So looking at those 3 photos of conservation fencing. Additional threat mitigation means removing and controlling of feral ungulates. So we see Evie with a boar in that top middle photo. We also have to mitigate for invasive plant species that can modify environments. So looking at Sebastian Ma'a and his crew from Forest Solutions and the work that they do in KS Maukakona lands, controlling fireweed and fountain grass. And then the bottom right-hand photo, I'm looking at small rodent control, small mammalian predators. And so we typically deploy automated rat traps that control rats, and rats are, for a number of reasons, they tend to cache seeds, so they tend to predate on fruit, and they can be really devastating to endangered plant populations. So moving ahead, the next part of our 5-tier or 5-pronged approach is monitoring. In this photo, are 2 friends and colleagues of mine. On the left, we have Matt Keir, who's our current state botanist. And on the right, we have Rob Robichaud of the Hawaiian Silversword Foundation, who has been a very inspirational force of nature for conservation on Hawaiʻi Island. He's mentored numerous people, and I can say with certainty that he's influenced pretty much everyone's career in conservation on Hawaiʻi Island for his work with silver swords in Clearmontia Peleana. Monitoring is important, as we shared, because we want to track the status of wild and reintroduced plants, looking for trends, both good and bad, with threats, phenology. So to make the most informed decisions, we need to have monitoring. Collections. So these are collections of all sorts. On the far left, we have fruit from Sikios albus that's restricted to windward Hawaiʻi Island. The middle, I have another colleague and friend, Lyman Perry, our current district botanist, monitoring a batch of Fligia neovaria cuttings. And on the far right, this person in particular deserves a shout out. She typically is behind the scenes, but on the right-hand side, we have Jamie Inoka, who manages the Volcano Rare Plant Facility. And without her efforts, I mean, she must have produced thousands, if not 1 million or so, rare plants that have gone back out onto our Hawaiʻi Island landscape. And none of this recovery work would be possible without her, and before her, Patty Moriyasu's efforts. Outplanting is a very important strategy. So we collect propagules, but we also have to get plants back on Aina, and making sure that Hawaiians are still in place where they belong. And in order to do that, we have to plant back individuals of both common and rare species. So the top left-hand photo is an outplanted individual of Cyanea marxii. The bottom left-hand photos show Callie Barnes again and Namaka Whitehead of Kamehameha Schools getting ready to outplant what's also depicted at right. Several individuals of Delicia arguditentata to KS Kona lands. And then last but not least of our 5-tiered approaches is probably my most favorite of things to do is surveying. And I just love being turned loose in the wild, sometimes going on for hours and hours alone, but it's definitely for me been the most effective way of learning flora and really learning an environment in such an intimate and, what can be a lonesome experience, especially when you work with just one other person. But on the far left-hand side, we have Natural Area Reserve Specialist Josh Vandemark, who was formerly the PEP coordinator. He and I have covered a lot of miles across Hawaii Island, but showing the different survey methods. So he's getting ready to rappel down a sheer cliff in Kohala. So looking at coastal vegetation in Kohala. In the middle frame, 2 additional friends. We have Susan Ching, who's the Oahu District botanist, and Mililani Browning, who is my colleague and friend at Kamehameha Schools, in a helicopter and getting ready to survey and access some remote sites in the northern Ko'olau. And on the far right is an image that was actually taken from a helicopter. So the helicopter is a very useful conservation tool for accessing remote sites, but also for doing aerial surveys. And so if you look at that photo, and I'm just gonna click really fast, you can see our target species there, and that is Pritchardia lanigera. That's a Hawaii Island endemic. And so these are the kinds of tools that we use to survey. And since we're coming up on time and we want to leave adequate time if there are any questions or mana'o from the audience, I'd like to round this off with our Hawaii Island endemics. And there are so many to choose from, but I narrowed it down to 3 endemic taxon to Hawaii Island. And the first is the liana pictured in the center of the screen. So these are propagated individuals. And then on the far left, you can see keiki silver sword that's coming up as well in the greenhouse. So this species is Visia menziesii. There is no recorded or known Hawaiian name. However, I think it would be really beneficial if we could have further research to look in Nupepa or other historic repositories to see if an inoa can be found, or if not, if there's a protocol, because this is such a spectacular plant. It makes me think there must have been a Hawaiian name. This plant is critically endangered and managed by the Plant Extinction Prevention Program. There's approximately 20 wild individuals restricted to a single population on Hawaii Island. And then from our Western context, it was first recorded and collected in 1794 by Menzies. By 1978, this species had declined so much that it has the distinction of being the first listed endangered plant in the whole United States. And then from a management mana'o for this one, we are currently in the process of securing collections. We've collected from nearly half of the wild population, and they're thriving in Janie's greenhouse. And we have plans in early 2023 to continue monitoring and collecting from remaining individuals. Our next species to highlight, this particular plant has gotten a lot of press recently, and this is a beautiful photo. I don't know whose photo I borrowed this from, but it's definitely from someone that has a better camera and definitely does not use an iPhone, but a stunning picture. And we will introduce this species. This is Delicia argudentata. This one also doesn't have a recorded Hawaiian name, but some folks use haha, which is assigned to Cyania in some cases, or using the adjective ki'i along with it, which means tall or high. This is also a critically endangered species managed by PEP. There are 3 known mature wild individuals. In 2002, this species was declared extinct in the wild. So the last wild individual died, but fortunately, DOFA has conducted extensive outplanting prior to that extirpation. So prior to that founder dying, there was a lot of seeds stored and a lot of outplanting to represent that founder. And then what's really exciting, and this is a really monumental part of this story, is that in 2021, a wild population was rediscovered by TMA propagation specialist Callie Barnes on KS lands in Kona. And this is particularly very exciting because it introduces new genetics into what we call a bottleneck population. So the existing outplants all represent the same founders. So to have increased genetics helps its chances of success and thriving. And so that's what our future management actions going into 2023 are, will be augmentations. So adding new genetics to prior introduction sites and vice versa. The last species that I would like to highlight and is definitely one of the most exciting finds. This species I saved for last because this species is a recent addition to Western science. So this had never been documented, and events like this are very rare on Hawaii Island because of our geographic age. You know, we're considerably younger than Kauai by a few million years, and undescribed species are rare on Hawaii Island. Prior to this discovery, the last new species was formally accepted in 2008. So that's Sertandra wagneri. And the amount of research and acceptance it takes to get species recognized can be cumbersome. So I want to introduce Shidea ha'akuaensis, again with no known Hawaiian name and severely endangered. There are no known wild individuals existing. And I just want to go through a brief timeline. So in 2016, this species was discovered by friend and colleague Tom Dement of the Division of Forestry and Wildlife while we were camping in and looking at a proposed fence line for a new conservation unit in Hamakua. In 2017, a bunch of us went back outside to the site and discovered that the individual was dead. Josh Vandermark collected samples trying to revive the meristem, as well as soil. We gathered a bunch of soil from beneath the tree. And to clarify, this was epiphytic on a ohia. The soil went to Jamie and her team, but unfortunately, there were no seedlings and the vegetative material was not successful either in generating propagules. So 2018, we went back out again, collected soil, and lo and behold, a year later in 2019, 2 seedlings emerged, one which became mature and reproductive. So observing the first flowering in 2021. And that event allowed the species to be described by Tom Weller and Ann Sakai of UC Davis and allowed for propagation. And I believe an outplanting may have happened. My data is a little bit dated here. But I believe the first reintroduction happened within the past year. And there is ex situ representation in Volcano and in Irvine, California. So very exciting that new discoveries are still to be had across the islands. And with that, I know that we're coming up on time. I just want to close with this pretty picture of Phyllostesia racemosa, which is also endemic to the Big Island. So mahalo to everybody for logging on and joining, and especially mahalo to the Hawaiʻi NAE staff out of Wailoa Arts Center and TMA's Imipono no Ka'aina program. Mahalo for the opportunity to share and inspiring the next cohort of conservationists. So mahalo nui.
Yay, thank you so much, Reid. That was excellent. So excellent. That was a really wonderful presentation. Does anyone have questions? If you're, not wanting to unmute yourself, you can feel free to type it in the chat, or you can, just go ahead and ask away. And if there aren't any questions, that's fine too. But yes, we appreciate you guys all for being here. Yeah, go ahead. Questions, anybody?
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks again for this presentation. I really appreciate it and taking the time. I'm an artist and I would love to be able to illustrate some of these plants. Where can I do that? Like how, I can't use other photographers' pictures of them because they are copyrighted usually. And so I would need to take like my own pictures and my own sketches. And I just don't even know where to begin to look for that.
Mahalo nui, that is a great question. And we can connect afterward if you would like some of the photos that I shared, especially of their personal photos for your use. The other recommendation that I would put forward is contacting the Hawaiian Rare Plant Program, and specifically our state botanist, Matt Keir. There could be some guidance that he could provide and additional resources for you to use. Oh, and I guess the last thing, I know photos are one way of capturing a moment, but if you get in contact, and I can share some of that information with you, is that different organizations across the Pai'aina or the state facilitate outplanting opportunities. It may take a little bit of coordination because of the status of some of these plants, but there are opportunities that I can share as well if you're interested.
Thank you, Sarah, for that question. I think that you probably weren't alone in that one, and that there's plenty of other folks that, would love to create artwork around these plants, but it's like, how do you do this? Because they're so rare. So thank you for asking that. And hopefully.
Yes, this is Diana Carlson.
Hi, Diana.
Hi, aloha, everyone. And I did the bellflower, the Ohawaii. And yes, I had the same question as Sarah, the artist Sarah, is how do I connect? How do I get involved? How can I, because like she said, I can't create a painting in oil or watercolor or whatever without it being my original point of view, as Sarah is saying. So I'm right on there. Amelie, if we can connect with you, and Reid, I'm very interested.
Thank you, Diana. And I think that's our biggest thing, is we do want to connect you folks to being able to, use these as inspiration. Yeah, so thank you, Ursi. Yeah, we definitely need to let folks know when things are happening. I'm not sure, as far as at TMA, Three Mountain Alliance, we do offer, community days where we're out planting native species. They aren't necessarily endangered species, but definitely feel free to email me if you want to get on our volunteer list. We can let you know when things are going on. We also try to let folks know when other organizations are having, public events that, volunteers are needed for. But, you do have to keep in mind too, since we are dealing with, such rare plants that are very delicate and fragile that, they are pretty specific of who they would let plant these plants. So that is also something kind of to consider, not to say that you guys aren't all fabulous, great people, but just to kind of keep that in mind that, it is a very delicate situation. And there is that kind of protectiveness around it. Let's see, any other, oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you both so much. Emily, thank you so much for hosting Reid. That was really exciting. It was especially thrilling at the end, hearing all of those stories. Like Fickia menzizii has been one of the plants that's like one of my life goals to see that. So it's super exciting to hear it's here. I didn't even know it was on the Big Island. So that was super exciting. And then your story about the Shadea species is amazing. And before you told that story, my question was going to be like, yeah, what are some of your personal highlights of your career so far in terms of like discovering something or seeing something succeed? And so I know you just told like a few stories, but if you had any other ones that pop into your mind, since you're right here live with us, I'd love to hear it. Yeah, that was already very exciting.
Thank you. These days, unfortunately, I'm not as active as I used to be, although I still think I have some pep in my step and try to get out with different pep programs across the state. To be honest, I think for me personally, when a discovery is made, let alone one that is by through me, my first reaction is like I typically just get really quiet and just kind of take it all in. There's definitely that chicken skin feeling, but I guess a number of things go through my head. The fact that it's amazing that this plant is still on the landscape despite the amount of pressures and stressors that continue to inundate native ecosystems. So just that kind of amazement, but it also, as our friends would say, it also creates a manifest for upcoming work, because that the next part is like, oh, now we're going to mark the DZ and bring in the helicopter to bring fencing materials and fence it off, and then subsequently do the monitoring and collections. But probably some of my most exciting finds have been, I guess, along the Hamakua coast. So drainages in areas that are inaccessible to ungulates typically have higher concentrations of species richness. And too many to name, but we've seen Ocrosia or Hole in those areas, endangered Hawaiʻi or Sertandras, different Cyanea species. And when you find that, what I usually call is you have to get in the zone. So doing your homework, looking at the forest type and anticipating the suite of species that you encounter. And when you see that many in an area, that's what really makes me smile.
Dave, thank you for that question. Yeah.
I have a question.
Oh.
So you pointed to one thing that is like a new species. So we're talking about these species that are going extinct, but are you discovering new species?
That's a good question. So to, I guess, answer that one, new species discoveries are rare on Hawaii Island. And that's kind of due to a few things, you know, our geologic age. So we haven't had as much radiation as some other islands. You know, species here are probably still going through those processes. So that's the first, is our young geologic age makes that difficult. The second, and I should have had a map of that, of the Big Island, but the amount of land changes on our island, because we're so young and we don't have those defined valleys and terrain like Kauai, Oahu, and the islands to the northwest of us, so much of our land has been converted to pastoral uses. You know, we see impacts up to 10,000 feet in elevation in some areas where you can drive a vehicle or move animals. And because of that, you know, discoveries have been rare. But however, discoveries are more common, and I mean, they're still rare, but areas such as West Maui has been having a lot of cool things happening, and then Kauai with all their numerous endemic species. So those islands are, you know, the likelihood has been higher of new discoveries.
Okay. Thanks. Yeah, I was wondering.
I'm wondering if there are any resources that you recommend, like any books that have been written or that can identify some of these plants, or is it not written down any place?
Good question. You know, most people, the go-to is the Manual of Flowering Plants by Warren Wagner and Daryl Herbst and Somner. That publication is quite dated, as it was last updated in 1999, so over 20 years ago. So typically what we use is a hybrid. The manual is a good starting place. If you, and I can, maybe I'll get in contact with Emily to email some of these things out afterward, but for more recent publications, the Laukahi Network, which is accessible online, has a running list of research projects dealing with Hawaiian flora. So for some of those new descriptions and recognitions, that would be a good place. And then the last thing, not to complicate this overly, is that the Manual of Flowering Plants is a result of many contributions. So besides numerous researchers and authors contributing to that, it also is a gathering place or a repository for many past descriptions. So from famous botanists like Joseph Rock and William Hillebrand, those resources are also still used today, and they may be a little bit harder to track down, but I think a lot of those, you know, have been uploaded and digitized.
Awesome. Thank you, Reid. And I hopefully I sent the right link in the chat to the Laukahi Network. But yeah, if you could please feel free to send me, you know, any resources that you have, and I can send these out to these folks. So that would be really great. I do want to wrap this up. We are a little after 7 here. I do want to again mahalo you guys for joining us this evening. It was, you know, really great to have you all here, and yeah, I hope you're taking away lots of new ike from this, and yeah, we really appreciate you for participating, and yeah, hopefully you'll be able to find some inspiration for it. So thank you all, and thank you, Reid, for sharing with us this evening and taking your time to be here.
Thank you.
Hello.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. We'll say ahui.
Yeah. Ahui.